They laughed at him, just a homeless man with a cardboard sign and a limp. They didn't know he once led missions that saved lives, or that one quiet phone call would shake the very ground beneath their feet. What they saw was nobody. They mocked was a war hero hiding in plain sight. And when the truth came out, it didn't just change their lives, it changed an entire city. If you've ever judged someone by what they've lost instead of what they've survived, this story will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The wind coming down from the river carried that early. November bite, the kind that made the skin around your knuckles split and burn without bleeding. Jeremiah Cole sat on the upturned milk crate he'd dragged from behind the auto repair shop 2 weeks ago, his back to the wall of the gas station on 5th and Holloway. It was the same spot every morning ever since the shelter turned him out. At the end of September, overcapacity, they'd said, as if the word capacity held any warmth or memory. He'd stopped counting how many days he'd sat there. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th week, time stopped moving forward. It just circled in front of him lay a faded cardboard sign, flattened from use and softened at the edges by rain and wear. U.S. veteran, anything helps. It read in bold Sharpie, written once by a volunteer at the outreach tent 3 months ago. Jeremiah didn't ask for new markers, didn't see the point. The message either landed or it didn't. The corner of 5th and Holloway was a liminal space, too far from the nicer strip malls to be useful, too close to the highway exit to be ignored entirely. People came and went in bursts. Gas station regulars, folks getting off night shifts, drivers grabbing cigarettes or coffee. He'd come to recognize the rhythms of it. Who left change, who gave nods, who avoided eye contact altogether. Most did. The latter this morning had started like any other. A paper cup of gas station coffee, paid for with change left by a tow truck driver the night before. Half a cinnamon roll and wax paper dropped off by Jasmine, the liquor store clerk, who always said, "You remind me of my uncle," without explaining what she meant. Jeremiah didn't ask, he never asked. He wore 3 layers of old flannel over a hoodie under a patched army field jacket, the kind that clung to the body even when it stiffened in the cold. His jeans were held together with stubborn seams, and duct tape on the right knee. His boots, standard issue from a decade ago, still bore the faint ghost of desert dust in the seams. No matter how many streets they crossed, his hair was graying at the temples now, a thick halo of black coils pressed down by an old knit cap. The morning traffic hissed past, slow and impatient. A police cruiser rolled by without stopping. The officer inside glanced at him once, then back to the road, as if checking off a box. Jeremiah didn't blame him. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he didn't reek of alcohol or wave his arms like some others did when they felt invisible. Just after 8:30, when the sun had lifted, enough to cast long shadows from the station canopy, a black SUV pulled up to the corner and idled, shiny, late model, with tinted windows and a chrome grille that looked too polished for the neighborhood. Jeremiah didn't move, didn't straighten his sign, didn't do anything at all. He had learned not to expect too much from curiosity. The driver's side window rolled down halfway. Jeremiah looked up only briefly. He saw a young man in the passenger seat, baseball cap, hoodie, sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. Behind the tinted glass, more movement, laughter muffled by the closed doors, but loud enough to carry over the hum of the engine. A phone lifted, tilted downward at an angle. A picture. Jeremiah looked back at the pavement. He didn't react, didn't shift. He let the moment pass the way he let most things pass, quietly and without demand. The SUV didn't drive off right away. It idled for a few more seconds. More laughter, then a voice from inside. "Play soldier for the camera." "Old man?" The door cracked open a bit, just enough to suggest escalation, and then it shut again. Tires peeled slightly as the vehicle turned the corner, disappearing toward the strip mall. The gas station's glass doors opened with a chime, and the cashier stepped out with a trash bag in one hand and a glance in Jeremiah's direction. "They mess with you?" he asked, voice low. Jeremiah shook his head. "Just noise." He didn't say more. Not about the SUV, not about the camera, not about the way the boy in the back seat reminded him of someone he once carried on his shoulders through a dust storm in Kandahar, back when he still had the strength for other people's weight. The wind picked up again, Jeremiah shifted slightly and reached into his inner coat pocket. He felt the familiar rectangle of his flip phone dead, uncharged, nearly forgotten. But not today. He turned it over in his hand like a token. Then, slowly, quietly, he opened it. The screen flickered, then came to life with a tired glow. One bar of signal, just enough. He stared at the keypad for a moment, thumb hovering over a number he hadn't dialed in over 5 years, and then, with the same calm resolve that once guided him through enemy fire and broken comms, he pressed call. The SUV rolled back into view a few minutes after it disappeared around the corner, circling the lot like it was looking for trouble it could afford. The low growl of its engine undercut the hum of weekday traffic, making heads turn without meaning to. It parked at a slant near the ice machine outside the gas station convenience store. Doors popped open in quick succession. For an all-land, out stepped a group of young men, maybe late teens, maybe early 20s. They wore the uniform of this side of the city: puffer jackets, flat brims, scuffed sneakers with barely tied laces, and voices just loud enough to demand attention from people who had no intention of giving it. Jeremiah didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the tempo of this kind of energy, the kind that came not from confidence, but from trying hard to appear full when something inside had been hollowed out. The first one to speak was a tall kid with a face still caught between boyhood and arrogance. "Yo, is that a real sign? Like tactual veteran?" His voice carried across the lot, laughing as he approached. Another one followed close behind, holding up his phone, already recording. "Man, I'm about to go viral with this. Watch this." His laughter cut sharp through the air as he angled the camera toward Jeremiah. "Say cheese, Sergeant Sadness." Jeremiah didn't flinch. Not a muscle in his body moved. He kept his hands folded in his lap, fingers curled around the edge of his jacket sleeve. His head remained bowed just slightly, chin tucked against the collar of his flannel. He didn't speak. He didn't challenge. He just breathed. The third one, younger than the others, and wearing a camouflage hoodie, walked up close enough to cast a shadow over Jeremiah's boots. "Yo, for real though," he said. "This man out here pretending to be a vet. Bet he just found that jacket in a thrift bin. Ain't no real soldier sitting in front of a shell station holding a cardboard sign." That's when the laughter got louder, the kind of laugh meant to draw a line between them and him. Not a laugh shared, but one performed. There's a difference. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at the space Jeremiah occupied. The space he reminded them of, something between failure and fear. The fourth one stayed back. He leaned against the SUV door, not laughing, not filming, just watching. His arms were crossed and his jaw was tight. He looked at Jeremiah a little too long, like something wasn't sitting right, but he said nothing. His silence was the only thing that registered as human in the moment. Inside the gas station, the clerk peeked over the counter and then ducked back down, pretending to clean something. He wasn't paid enough to intervene. The second one, the one still filming, crouched low and shouted into the phone's mic, "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Commander Krusty, protector of spare change and old gum." He panned the camera around for dramatic effect, catching the gas station sign, the parked cars, and Jeremiah sitting stone still like he hadn't heard a word. But Jeremiah had heard it all. Not just their words, but the layers behind them, the need to be louder than the world around them, the fear dressed in jokes, the certainty that nothing they said had consequences. The boy in the camouflage hoodie moved as if he was going to touch the sign, maybe snatch it or kick it aside, but the fourth one spoke for the first time. "Leave it," he said. The others turned, surprised. He pushed off the SUV, shaking his head. "Man, come on, let's just get the chips and bounce." Reluctantly, they pulled back, still laughing, still loud. But now a little less sure of their momentum, they swaggered into the convenience store, shouting something about hot Cheetos and grape soda, the door chime ringing behind them like a punctuation mark. Jeremiah finally moved. He reached down and slowly turned his sign upright again, the corner of the cardboard having been kicked out of alignment. He straightened it with care, pressing the edge against his boot to flatten it. The letters were still visible. Anything helps. The SUV's windows caught the reflection of the midday sun. The shine bounced off them like mirrors, as if trying to erase what had just happened. But the sound of that laugh, sharp, hollow, careless, hung in the air longer than any engine growl or teenage swagger. They laughed at a man who once pulled 2 wounded soldiers from a Humvee under fire, who radioed in coordinates with a shattered arm and guided a medevac chopper through dust so thick it felt like drowning. They laughed at a man who knew the names of the fallen by memory, who carried their birthdays in the folds of his mind like sacred codes. They laughed without knowing. They were performing for a ghost. The door chime rang again. They came out with bags in hand, faces flushed with sugar and bravado. The tall one tossed a crumpled dollar in Jeremiah's direction like it was part of a game. "Here you go, General. Buy yourself a parade." It didn't land near him. It blew away with the wind. Jeremiah didn't move, didn't speak, just sat and let the laugh echo one last time across the lot. The wind picked up again after they left, sweeping across the parking lot and rattling the empty soda can near Jeremiah's boot. He didn't look up, just kept staring at the concrete, at the black stain near the gas pump where something had leaked and dried long ago. The same stain he stared at most mornings. His face remained calm, expressionless, even, but something in his shoulders had shifted, just barely. The kind of shift that only someone watching closely would notice. He'd learned not to respond, not to give the moment any more life than it already demanded. They wanted a reaction, something to laugh at again later, something to post, maybe even something to fight. Jeremiah knew that trap, knew the price of stepping into it. It wasn't the first time 3 weeks earlier. A man in a red pickup had driven past and shouted, "Go get a job." Without slowing down, a month before that, a woman walking her dog had muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "Scam artist." She had never even made eye contact. None of them did. They didn't see a person, just a placeholder. For guilt, for fear, for something they couldn't quite name and didn't want to try. Still, it hurt. Not the words necessarily. Words were easy to ignore. What hurt was the reminder that he was no longer the man in the uniform, no longer Sergeant Jeremiah Cole, just another body on a sidewalk with a sign and a story nobody asked for. His right hand moved slowly to the collar of his flannel, fingers trembling slightly in the cold. He reached inside, beneath the first layer, then the second, and there they were. The dog tags. The metal was cold against his skin. He gripped them lightly, pulling them free just enough to see the lettering. It had faded over the years, but the name was still clear. Cole, Jeremiah A. He held them in his palm like they might anchor him to something. A memory, a truth. He used to wear them with pride, back when they meant something different, back when they were proof that he belonged somewhere. Now he kept them tucked away, hidden. Not because he was ashamed, but because he'd learned that most people didn't want the story that came with them. He looked down at the tags, lips barely parting. "Still here?" he whispered. Just 2 words, said to no one. Said because it was important to say them. Even if no one else was listening, he closed his fingers around the metal and let his hand fall back into his lap. The moment passed, as they always did. The parking lot returned to its usual rhythm. Cars came and went. A delivery truck pulled up to the side of the gas station, its driver tossing plastic crates filled with snack bags onto a dolly. Music leaked out of a passing sedan, something with heavy bass and lyrics Jeremiah didn't recognize. He watched it all with the quiet detachment of someone who had long since learned how to disappear without leaving. No one looked at him twice. Even after the commotion from the SUV, even after the shouting and the laughter, no one asked if he was okay. No one checked. Jasmine came by around 10:30, walking over from the liquor store with a wrapped pastry in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. She didn't say much, never did, but she always made sure he had something in his stomach by mid-morning. "They still messing with you?" she asked, nodding in the direction the SUV had gone. Jeremiah shook his head. "Once, just kids," he said. Jasmine squinted at him. "Kids don't know nothing about dignity," she said. Then she handed him the food and walked back across the lot without another word. He took the bottle and set it beside him, then unwrapped the pastry slowly. It was a honey bun today, soft in the middle and too sweet, but it helped. He ate quietly, watching the sun climb higher across the station's sign and into the edges of the clouded sky. The pain had dulled over the years. Not the physical pain, though that too was a constant hum in his bones, but the other kind. The kind that came from being forgotten, from being erased slowly, not by force, but by neglect. Still, even with all that he hadn't left, he hadn't. Given in, something kept him here, day after day, on this corner, beneath this gas station sign, facing whatever came. It wasn't pride, exactly. It wasn't even hope. It was something older than both, something harder to kill. The dog tags clinked faintly beneath his shirt as he leaned back against the wall again, a sound no one else heard, but to Jeremiah, it was enough. The noise faded slowly, swallowed by the rhythm of the street, engines humming, distant horns, the sharp click of crosswalks shifting from red to white. The black SUV that brought the laughter was gone now. Jeremiah sat still in the cold shadow of the gas station's east wall, the cracked pavement beneath him gritty with salt dust and old oil. He didn't look up, didn't turn his head. His hands rested on his knees like weights that had nowhere else to go. He waited until the lot was quiet again, until the last of the echo had bled from the air. Then, slowly, he shifted. One hand slipped into the inner lining of his jacket, past the worn seams and faded lining. He felt for it by touch, the familiar bulk of plastic and metal. The flip phone had been with him for nearly a decade. It was scratched, dull and scarred, much like the hands holding it. But it still worked, or at least he hoped it did. He opened the hinge slowly, the soft snap louder in his ears than it was in reality. The screen flickered with age, but it lit one bar. That was enough. Jeremiah stared at the keypad for a moment, his thumb hovering just above the numbers. The weight of the moment pressed harder than the cold. He had only used this number once. Years ago, a number given to him not by a friend or family, but by a man in uniform with a serious face and an even more serious voice. "You earned a favor," the man had said back then, slipping the number into the pocket of Jeremiah's dress blues. One call, any time. He'd almost forgotten about it, not because he didn't remember, but because he had never believed in collecting. Pride got in the way of things like that. But now, the weight of everything of the concrete under him, the stairs, the laughter, the long nights with no roof, and longer days with no name, had become something else, something tighter, something final. His thumb pressed the numbers with care, slow, deliberate, no rush. This wasn't a call for casual conversation. The line rang once, then again, then a voice comm/mail. "This line is secure." Jeremiah didn't introduce himself, didn't explain where he was or what had happened. The words that came out were soft but steady. Time to cash it in. Silence followed, not confusion, not surprise, just silence. Then the voice returned. Understood, location. Jeremiah's eyes scanned the lot. He read the faded numbers on the side of the gas station and glanced across the street at the intersection signed 5th and Holloway. He'd been staring at that green metal post every day for weeks, never thinking he'd have to say it out loud. Corner of 5th and Holloway. East side, by the Shell. Someone will be in touch within 24 hours. The line clicked. Off. Jeremiah closed the phone and let it rest in his palm. The quiet settled again, but it felt different now, tighter around the edges. Like the world had just taken a breath it hadn't meant to. He didn't move right away, just held the phone, thumb brushing over the chipped paint near the hinge. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt something stir under the weight. Not hope, that was too big a word, not relief either, but something close, like a long-held breath at the edge of release. The favor had never been meant for comfort. It was never about lifting him off the street or writing a check to make the past vanish. It was about something older, a promise made in the kind of silence that only follows chaos. Men who'd seen too much and said too little, offering a thread for when things got too tight. He'd just pulled the thread. A breeze cut across the lot again, lifting a plastic bag and spinning it toward the street. Jeremiah tucked the phone back into his jacket and leaned his head against the wall. The concrete was cold, so was the metal against his chest, but the silence now was no longer empty. Something had shifted, and he had just started the clock. The phone rang just once on the desk in his study, but it was enough to stop the pen in General Aaron Beckett's hand. He didn't answer it right away. He looked at the screen. The number was one he had memorized years ago, not because he expected it to be used, but because he couldn't bear the idea of not recognizing it if it ever was. He had given that number only once, scribbled on the inside of a folded-up operations card, slipped into the front pocket of a man who was walking out of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center with half his weight in bandages and the other half in silence. "If you ever need to cash it in," Beckett had told him, "call this number." Number? Questions, no hesitation. That was 8 years ago. Long enough for most men to forget, but not the kind of men they were. He picked up the phone and answered with the same cadence he used back then. "This line is secure." What came next was a voice he hadn't heard in nearly a decade, but he recognized it immediately. A voice that once called out coordinates over gunfire. A voice that didn't ask for anything until it had exhausted every other option. Time to cash it in. That was all. Beckett didn't speak for a long moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the weight of those 5 words landed like a command. Not loud, not desperate, just final. The kind of tone only used by someone who had held the line long enough to bleed from it. He stood slowly, the chair creaking behind him as he rose. His study was quiet, the walls lined with framed medals and commendations, old photographs from dusty forward operating bases, and shelves filled with manuals that hadn't been updated in years. The house was modest for a man of his rank outside of D.C., tucked in a quiet corner of Virginia, far from noise and attention. Beckett had chosen it for the silence, but this moment broke through even that. He brought the phone to his ear and asked simply, "Where are you?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the reply came steady. 5th and Holloway, East Side, gas station. Beckett nodded to himself. Understood. The call ended there. No explanations, no pleasantries, no soft landing. He set the phone down gently and walked to the tall wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside was a black binder, thinner than most, with a single tab at the top labeled "One Call." He flipped it open and scanned the first page. A list of names, one circled in red ink, Cole. Jeremiah A. Beckett exhaled through his nose and pinched the bridge of his nose between his fingers. He remembered Jeremiah as clearly as if they had just returned from deployment last week. A man who moved with precision, never wasted words, never raised his voice. In the chaos of field command, that kind of presence was rare. Cole didn't speak often, but when he did, men listened. They trusted him with their lives, and he never let them down. Until the last. Tours. Beckett remembered the after-action report. How Cole had pulled 2 men from the wreckage of a transport hit by an IED. How he had refused extraction until every man on his team was accounted for. And how, when they finally medevaced him out, he didn't say goodbye to anyone. He just disappeared, quietly, efficiently. For a while, Beckett tried to keep tabs on him through unofficial channels. But, like so many veterans, Cole slipped through the cracks into a system designed to process cases, not people. The kind of man who never asked for help because he didn't know how to need it until now. Beckett closed the binder and pulled out his phone again. This time, he didn't wait for it to ring more than once. "Miriam," he said. When the woman on the other end picked up, "I need a location detail and immediate intel on a gas station at 5th and Holloway. Tell base command this is a personal activation. Use clearance code, Foxtrot 79er. Understood," she said. "And Miriam, get me a line to General Cross at Camp Vigilant. Tell her it's about a man named Jeremiah Cole." Beckett paused once more before hanging up. He wasn't sure what Jeremiah had seen since they last spoke, but whatever it was, it had brought him to the edge. And when a man like that says it's time, you don't ask why, you move. The morning sun in Kandahar was sharp and white, washing over the compound in a way that made every edge feel harder. Dust floated in the air like ash, too fine to settle. Sergeant Jeremiah Cole adjusted the strap on his flak vest and scanned the courtyard. The mission briefing had ended 20 minutes earlier, but he was still going over the map in his head dangles, choke points, fallback paths. He didn't trust the terrain too quiet, too predictable. That kind of quiet never meant safety out. There, it meant someone was waiting. The convoy had to move. 12 men to transport vehicles and a single route back to the forward outpost. Routine supply sweep, nothing special on paper, but Cole knew better. He always had a feel for the gaps in intel, the things that didn't sit right, and today, something about the route screamed wrong. They loaded up, Cole riding in the second vehicle behind Lieutenant Marsh, A green officer just a year out of West Point. Good head, smart kid, but too eager. Too textbook, the type that thought. Armor made them invincible. Cole sat beside the rear gunner and kept his eyes moving. The road cut through a narrow valley, steep rock to the left, a shallow creek bed to the right. No visibility past the bends. He leaned forward and tapped the shoulder of the driver. Speed, steady. Don't outrun your eyes. The driver nodded. No questions. Everyone respected Cole that way. He wasn't loud. He didn't pull rank with bravado. He just knew what he was doing. That calm had a gravity to it. The first explosion hit just after the second bend. Improvised, buried deep. The ground lifted under the lead vehicle. Fire and dirt and steel shredding upward into a ball of orange. The world tilted sideways. Cole's vehicle slammed to a stop. AMB-USH. The call came late. Too late. Gunfire opened up from the ridge. Automatic, controlled. These weren't amateurs. These were trained fighters, positioned high with the sun. At their backs, Cole didn't wait for orders. He grabbed the rear radio and slid out the side door, dragging the gunner with him. Bullets skipped off the metal chassis, kicking up sparks and heat. Smoke, left flank. Now, 2 soldiers deployed cover, thick gray plumes hissing into the air. Cole moved low, dragging Private Odell, whose leg was bleeding out from a shrapnel tear. The medpack was shredded, but Cole tied off the limb with his own belt and pushed him behind the axle. He didn't hesitate. He never did. That's what made him different. A second wave of fire poured down, this time targeting the rear vehicle. Cole recognized the tactic, draw them into recovery, then hit the rescuers. He counted the muzzle flashes. 3 shooters, maybe 4. He needed elevation. Fast, he ducked behind a boulder and keyed the secondary radio. This is Sergeant Cole. We are taking heavy fire. Requesting immediate air support. Coordinates 046-072, friendly wounded, engaging fallback plan Delta. There was no response yet. Come interference. He knew they might be alone for a while, so he moved. He and 2 others corporal. Hanley and Specialist King scaled the low edge of the creek bed, flanking the shooter's left position. Every inch was exposed. Cole led, rifle steady, not a single movement wasted. A round grazed his shoulder, but he didn't break stride. By the time they reached the ridge, one shooter was already repositioning. Cole took him down with 2 shots. The second, clean through the neck. The others scattered. Cole ordered Hanley and King to hold position and signal the rest to regroup. Then he turned back. That's when the third explosion hit. He didn't remember the blast itself, just the sound. A hollow, rushing silence. Then the pain bright and electric, rising from his leg like fire, eating upward. He was thrown 6 feet, landed in the dust, and when he tried to stand, the world tilted again. His left leg was gone below the knee, just gone. But the others were moving. He saw them. Saw the rest of the unit rally behind the ridge, dragging the wounded, laying suppressive fire, falling into formation like they'd trained to, because Cole had held the line long enough for them to breathe. Later, when they carried him out, he was conscious enough to give coordinates again. "Get the others first," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." 12 men made it out alive that day. 2 more than the odds said should have. The Silver Star came 6 months later in a quiet ceremony stateside he didn't attend, sent a note instead. Said, "I didn't do anything those men wouldn't have done for me." No one ever asked what he lost out there because they thought they knew. The wind funneled through the alleyway behind the pawn shop like it always did, sharp, narrow, and carrying the scent of last night's garbage from the Chinese takeout. Across the street, Jeremiah moved slowly, his gait uneven, one foot planting heavier than the other, the limp more noticeable at the end of the day. He held the strap of his duffel close to his chest, keeping it from swinging. It didn't carry much, just a change of socks, a thermal blanket, a small Bible with frayed edges, and a plastic sandwich bag filled with pills he rationed carefully. The rest he kept in his coat. Pockets weren't for hands anymore. They were for survival. He ducked between 2 dumpsters and into the narrow corridor of space behind the brick wall, where the city forgot things. This was where he slept most nights when the shelters were full or his name hadn't made the cut. His bed was a piece of plywood set over 2 stacked milk crates, with flattened cardboard boxes tucked beneath like extra sheets. He sat down with a slow exhale, the kind of sound that came from someone who'd learned to get comfortable without ever actually resting. No one had expected him to vanish. Not his unit, not the base, not even the officer who pinned his silver star and told him he'd have a dozen doors open when he got home. But those doors were harder to find than anyone had let on. Jeremiah didn't talk about Idnot, the transition, not the paperwork, not the way he'd walked into the VA office in San Diego wearing a suit 2 sizes too big and walked out 5 hours later, with nothing but an appointment scheduled 6 months down the line. They didn't see what he carried, not in his records, not in the way he sat to still or flinched at sudden sounds. They just saw a man with all his forms filled out improperly. The physical wounds, they understood. The missing leg below the knee came with codes, classifications, prosthetic options. But the rest? The waking up in sweat at 3 a.m., heart racing. Mind back in that valley where screams got caught in dust clouds that wasn't as easy to process. Not in their system, he tried. For a while, signed up for therapy, group sessions, work assistance. But the programs moved slow, lost files, shifted staff. Every time he built a plan, someone retired or moved departments or forgot to forward an email. So he drifted. At first, it was a couch in Bakersfield, then a cot in a mission shelter in Phoenix, then finally, the sidewalk. One morning, he looked up and realized he hadn't spoken to anyone who called him by name in over a month. He stopped introducing himself after that. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the stares. It was the feeling that his life had paused, but the rest of the world just kept driving by. He'd sit at bus stops and watch people go to work, to school, to lunch. He started recognizing faces in passing cars, same commuters every day, same routines, and not one of them knew he had once kept 12 soldiers alive in a firefight that tore through metal like it was paper. That kind of history didn't fit in a plastic cup. He pulled the blanket over his legs and leaned back against the cold brick, staring up at the thin strip of sky between buildings. He'd memorized that view. The same slice of stars, the same rusted fire escape ladder above him, the same blinking red light from the apartment window 4 floors up. A rat scurried past his foot. He didn't move. This place, this alley, had become the only thing stable. In a world that kept misplacing him, he didn't ask for handouts, didn't make signs that said hero. All he wanted was a place where the system didn't need to stamp his identity onto a form to see him, but that wasn't how the system worked. So here he was, Sergeant Cole, turned statistic wrapped in layers and silence, waiting out another night in a country he once swore to protect. General Aaron Beckett stood by the tall window of his study, the late afternoon light pooling on the hardwood floor like gold fading into copper. Outside, the trees of Northern Virginia were losing their leaves in slow spirals, one by one, carried down in the hush of a wind that had turned colder. He held the cordless phone in one hand, the other resting on the windowsill, knuckles white. From the grip, his jaw was set, the muscle in his cheek ticking rhythmically, like a clock winding down with a purpose only he knew. He had been quiet for nearly 15 minutes after the call from Jeremiah ended, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he was mapping the steps in his mind. Beckett had always moved like that, precise, deliberate patterns. Even retired, he kept the discipline that had shaped his life in war zones and briefings, in diplomatic rooms and armored convoys. The world, to Beckett, was still a chessboard. Some pieces just moved slower. He turned away from the window and picked up the old black notebook from the edge of the desk. The pages were dog-eared, filled with numbers written in pencil, phone, contacts never digitized for security. He flipped to the tab marked Obsidian. That was what he had called the section. Cold, dark, and carved from stone. Every name in there was someone who owed him or someone he owed. He pressed the first number into the landline. The call connected fast on the third ring. Vince Beckett said, not waiting for a hello. "It's me." A pause, then a warm voice. "Aaron. Damn, thought you'd fallen off the edge of the earth." Beckett didn't smile. "Need a name?" "Run. Quiet. Just a vet, probably flagged by DHS for existing in the wrong zip code. Don't log it. Don't mention it." "Understood." "Name?" "Jeremiah Cole, former Army. Last known to me was 2015. But he surfaced again 5th and Holloway, somewhere near Capital District." I want to know who's watching that block and what's in play." There was no hesitation. "Give me 4 hours." To a sigh. To it is. Beckett hung up. The second number was longer, international. He had to pull a slip of paper from the back of the notebook to finish dialing. The man on the other end answered in clipped English, immediately recognizing the voice. "I need a box delivered," Beckett said plainly. "Old specs. Same encryption, same drop line. Rebuild from last contract." "You're activating your protocol." "I am." Silence stretched on the line. "Then, you understand what that implies." "I do. I'll fund the shell from personal reserve. We'll call it humanitarian research. Same front company as the Baltic Logistics Project." "You're not with the DoD anymore, Aaron. Doesn't matter. I still know where the doors are, and I still have keys to some of them." The man exhaled through his nose. "Very well. I'll begin immediately." He clicked the receiver down, 2 calls made. One more dot this time. He picked up his cell. No notebook. This number he knew by heart. The line rang once, then again. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Beckett let out the faintest breath. Nina, Aaron. She had a voice like carved glass, sharp, clear, deliberate. The kind of voice that only came from someone who'd spent years translating pain into advocacy. "Remember that file I told you about?" he said. "The one you swore you'd never pull unless the wheels were about to fall off the country?" I lied. She didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, "Jeremiah." "Yes. Where is he?" "Sleeping in an alley behind a gas station, still wearing the jacket he bled in." "I assume this is personal." "It is." "I'll need everything," she said. "Medical, military, psychological, the real records, not what's buried under Department Inc. I'll get them to you tonight." There was a pause. "And what do you want me to do?" Beckett looked out the window again, watching a single yellow leaf detach from a branch and spiral downward. "I want you to remind the system what it owes him, and then I want you to make it pay." Nina didn't say goodbye. She just hung up Duckett. Stood still for a long while, the silence filling the corners of the room like fog. Outside, the world kept moving, but inside, the wheels had started turning, and this time they wouldn't stop. The liquor store stayed open later than most places in the neighborhood. Jasmine always closed up alone. The bell above the door had long since lost its cheerful jingle and now just gave a dull metallic rattle whenever someone entered or left. By 10:30, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale greenish hue on the cracked tile floor. Jasmine stood behind the counter, counting out the drawer. The register opened, its compartments half filled with small bills and coins. She moved with the kind of tired precision that came from doing the same job night after night without complaint, without recognition, without much choice. Her long braids were pulled into a high bun. A pencil stuck through them like a pin. Her apron was dusted with flour from the day's sandwich prep, and her earbuds dangled unused around her neck. She wasn't listening to music tonight. She didn't feel like drowning out the world. The silence in the store was enough. She glanced at her phone out of habit more than interest. Notifications, group chat, a video file. The title read, LMFAO. Look at this crusty vet. Her thumb hovered. She already knew who had sent it. There was only one group of people in her contacts who used that kind of language, that tone. She clicked play, already bracing. For whatever it was, it took 5 seconds for the wave of heat to rise in her chest. The video showed the parking lot from earlier that morning. She saw the black SUV pull up in frame, heard the laughter, saw the camera angle tilt to show Jeremiah sitting against the gas station wall, like always. Quiet, still, holding that same sign she had seen 100 times. U.S. veteran, anything helps. The voice on the video trays she recognized immediately mocked him without hesitation. The comments were fast, cruel, hollow. Yo, look at this dude, out here cosplaying Vietnam or something. She could hear the other boys laughing in the background, egging each other on. Then one of them tossed a crumpled bill in his direction like it was some kind of joke. The screen shook with movement and laughter. The video ended. Moved for a moment. Her jaw was clenched tight, her hand still holding the phone loosely on the counter. She stared at the blank screen, blinking back a burn that crept behind her eyes. Not because she was surprised they had always talked too loud, much but because they'd chosen him. Jeremiah, the man who never asked for anything, never raised his voice, never looked at anyone with anything but calm. The man who said thank you when she handed him a sandwich every morning, as if she were doing him some kind of huge favor. The man who once, after a cold snap in January, slipped a small note under the convenience store door that simply read, "Tell Jasmine, thank you for the gloves." I still have all my fingers. She opened the chat and scrolled back. Pictures. More jokes. One-liners about bums and people who don't want to work. She hadn't paid much attention before, just muted the thread months ago. But now, each message stung with a sharpness she hadn't expected. Her thumb moved quickly now. One name, delete contact, then another, and another. She wiped them from her phone, like smudges on glass. Then she went into the group chat and hit leave conversation. Done. Outside the store, the parking lot was empty again. The same overhead lamp flickered above the pump station across the way. The same trash tumbled across the sidewalk. The same bench sat near the fence line, still cold, still unused. And Jeremiah, he was probably asleep by now. In that alley behind the pawn shop, or maybe still sitting where the video had captured him because some nights he didn't move, just waited for the city to slow down. Jasmine set her phone aside and finished counting the drawer. When she was done, she took the last sandwich from the cooler, wrapped it carefully in a napkin, and wrote something in pen on the outside. Nothing long, just one word: respect. She'd leave it by the pump in the morning, where he always saw it first. She didn't owe him anything, but after what she saw, she knew the world owed him a hell of a lot more than they'd given. After the call, the corner of 5th and Holloway looked the same to anyone passing through. Same oil-stained pavement, same buzz from the streetlight that never turned off. Same slow shuffle of tired feet, headed to jobs that didn't pay enough. The gas station clerk restocked the shelves without looking up. Jasmine unlocked the liquor store 15 minutes early for a delivery. And Jeremiah Cole was exactly where people expected him to be, back against the wall, who'd pulled up, hands tucked into his sleeves, the cardboard sign folded neatly at his feet. But under the surface, something had shifted. It started with a city worker, Raymond, the man who came every Tuesday to check the water meter behind the alley. He'd seen Jeremiah more than a dozen times, always nodded, but never stopped. That morning, though, he paused. A quiet nod turned into something longer. His eyes scanned the lot, lingering on the curb where the black SUV had idled the day before. The SUV that came back again after dark, quiet, unmarked, with military plates, and a man in a pressed coat who stood across the street without saying a word. "You see that car last night?" Ramon asked the guy running the hot dog cart. Didn't. Looked like no regular cop car. Had base decals, government types. The hot dog man, Julian, didn't respond right away. He squinted in the direction of Jeremiah's corner. "I did," he said finally. Didn't stop, just watched him. 15 minutes, maybe more. By noon, the story had spread to the bus. "Stop," they say. "He used to be high up," a woman in a postal uniform said as she adjusted her messenger bag. "Like real military, not just some guy with a jacket." "Was it the VA?" someone else asked. "Or like Army intelligence?" "Nah," said a kid in a worn hoodie. "Word is, a general came through, like a real general, looking for him." They didn't use his name because most didn't know it. He was just the man who sat outside the gas station, polite and still, never asking, never causing trouble. He had become a fixture of the neighborhood, the way abandoned buildings and cracked sidewalks did familiar. Overlooked, but always there. But now people were looking closer. In the bakery across the street, the cashier leaned toward her coworker and whispered, "My cousin said she saw some guy with a clipboard taking photos around the block. Didn't talk to nobody, just stood there." At the corner barbershop, the topic came up between haircuts. "My uncle's in the reserves," one of the younger barbers said. He said black SUVs with base tags don't just roll through for nothing. They don't cruise gas stations unless someone in the car matters. All afternoon, more people noticed a man in a blue windbreaker parked across the street and sat in his sedan for half an hour. Engine off, just writing notes. Another woman in a long gray coat walked by 3 times, each time glancing toward Jeremiah, each time pretending not to. Even the teenagers who once laughed quieted when they passed by dusk. The street felt like it was waiting for something, like the air had grown heavy, as if sound traveled slower and eyes lingered longer. Jeremiah didn't speak. He watched the world without reacting, as he always had. But inside, he felt the ripple. Not just from the call, but from the shift. And how people moved around him. Jasmine brought him the usual sandwich and water, but this time she added something else. A folded napkin. He opened it when she was gone and read the word written in black ink. Respect. He didn't smile, didn't change his posture, but he tucked the napkin gently into his coat, just above the dog tags. No one said anything directly. No one asked questions, but the street knew. Someone had come looking for the man on the corner, and now the corner was watching back. The knock on the door wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. 3 short raps, evenly spaced, like something out of a courtroom or a command tent. Not the kind of knock that belonged to a neighbor, or a package delivery, or even the police. It was the sound of people who already knew you were inside and weren't going to leave until you answered. Trey was half asleep on the couch, game controller still in his hand. Reruns flickering silently on the TV. He blinked hard, sat up, and rubbed the back of his neck, trying to push away the grogginess. The knock came again, same rhythm, same tone. It raised the hairs on his arms. He stood, pulled his hoodie straighter, and walked to the door. Didn't bother checking the peephole. He was used to people showing up without notice. Friends, deliveries, the occasional complaint. But the moment he pulled the door open, everything about that confidence slipped. 3 men stood there, shoulder to shoulder. No uniforms, no badges, just dark suits, pressed collars, and stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't come from boredom, it came from control. The man in the center was taller, older, with gray at his temples and eyes that didn't wander. His hands were empty, but they were tucked behind his back like someone who had stood behind podiums or across from classified briefings. The man on the left carried a slim leather portfolio. The third had nothing at all, no clipboard, no phone, no bag, just a sideways glance that scanned Trey's living room without stepping inside. Trey opened his mouth, then closed it. Something told him not to ask who they were. "You're Trey Madison," the man in the center said. It wasn't a question. Trey nodded once. "We won't be long," the man continued, voice smooth but heavy. "We just came to talk?" Trey stepped back instinctively, letting them in before realizing he hadn't actually invited them. They walked in with slow, deliberate steps, taking in the room. A few pizza boxes on the table, gaming headset on the floor. Nothing unusual for a guy his age, but everything suddenly felt exposed. The man with the portfolio remained by the door. The third stood near the window, gazing out at the parking lot without a word. Only the center man moved toward Trey, standing. In front of the couch, like a teacher about to give a very specific lesson, "You recently filmed and distributed a video of a man named Jeremiah Cole," he said plainly. Trey blinked. I mean, yeah, just a dumb joke." It wasn't. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Trey swallowed hard. "We're not here to arrest you," the man continued. "We're not with local law enforcement. But the individual, you mocked Master Colas, a decorated war veteran, Silver Star recipient, former non-commissioned officer under U.S. command, you knew none of this, but you didn't care." Trey looked down at the floor. His voice came out small. "I didn't know that's exactly the problem." The man didn't raise his voice, he didn't move closer. But every word landed like a stone dropped in still water. Trey could feel it ripple through the center of his chest. You and your friends made a choice. You turned a phone into a weapon. You humiliated someone who has given more to this country than you will likely ever understand. The third man finally spoke, still looking out the window. And people noticed. More than you think. The one by the door opened the leather folder. Inside were printed screenshots. The video, comments, names. "We've removed the footage," the first man said, scrubbed it from the original source. "But that doesn't erase the impression it left, and it doesn't undo the consequences." Trey didn't know what to say. His throat felt tight. "Consider this your moment of clarity," the man said. "We're not here to ruin your life, but we will make sure you understand the weight of your actions. And if you or any of your friends attempt to retaliate, reshare, or undermine what we've done, we'll be back. That time, it will not be a conversation." Trey stood frozen as they turned to leave. The door clicked shut behind them. He didn't move for a long time. Later that night, he opened his group chat and typed 2 words, "We're done." Then he deleted the thread entirely. The couch felt smaller than it ever had. Trey sat with his knees too close together, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles paled. Across from him, the man with the gray temples leaned slightly forward in the chair, his elbows resting neatly on his thighs, fingers interlaced, gaze never breaking. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He spoke in the tone of someone used to giving briefings that could change policies or end them. "We know who you laughed at," the man said. Trey didn't speak. He barely nodded. "What you saw, what you recorded, was a man named Sergeant Jeremiah Allen Cole. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2005. Infantry, he volunteered for every difficult assignment he was offered. Deployed 4 times in 8 years. Afghanistan, Iraq. He led a unit that held an exposed outpost through a 36-hour firefight with no reinforcements. 12 lives were saved because of his decisions." The man paused to let the weight settle. He lost a leg in that battle, refused medevac until every soldier was accounted for, bled out in the back of a Humvee while giving commands through a handheld radio. Trey blinked rapidly, the words hitting one after another. Nothing dramatic in their delivery, just the kind of truth you couldn't argue with. 2 months later, he was awarded the Silver Star. Do you know what that is? Trey shook his head. Slightly, it's the 3rd highest military combat decoration, reserved for gallantry in action. Not given lightly, not given often. Cole never showed up to receive it in person. He declined the ceremony, told his commanding officer, and I quote, "I don't have time for cameras. Some of my guys still aren't sleeping right." The man stood now, not in anger, just to retrieve something from the folder held by the second agent. He laid it. On the coffee table, a photo, old, grainy, but clear enough. A younger Jeremiah, helmet askew, face streaked with dirt and dried blood. Arms outstretched to 2 soldiers, pulling a third from rubble. "That's who you mocked," the man said. "That's who you recorded without consent. That's the man your group of friends turned into a joke." Trey leaned forward, hands over his mouth, his shoulders rising with a breath he couldn't quite release. "Do you understand?" the man continued. "What it means when someone like him activates an old contact?" He let the question hang. Jeremiah Cole hasn't asked for help in almost a decade. But this week, he did. And that means things are moving. Now people who don't normally move, agencies that don't respond to everyday requests, are suddenly paying attention. Not because he demanded it, but because of who he is. The other agent finally spoke up. "And because of who we are, you don't need to know our titles. Just understand we don't waste our time on neighborhood bullies. But in this case, we showed up. That should tell you everything." The man with the gray temples leaned forward again, quieter now. "We've seen men like Cole, discarded, forgotten, broken by systems that are supposed to honor them. But once in a while, a line gets crossed, and when it does, the people he once bled for decide it's time to do something about it." Trey's voice came out small. "I didn't know you didn't care," the man said evenly, "but now you do." He tapped the photo once, softly. "Jeremiah Cole is not a footnote. He is not disposable. And if you take anything away from this conversation, let it be the smoking. A man like that doesn't make you brave. It makes you forgettable." The silence afterward felt like a verdict. Trey stared at the photo, unable to look away. The man in the picture had nothing in common with the one he'd jeered at from a distance. And yet now he understood that. They were the same dot, and he realized maybe for the first time in his life how little he really understood about what courage looked like. The alley was quiet that night, quieter than usual. The street sounds had faded into the distance, leaving behind only the occasional drip from a cracked gutter pipe and the rustle of newspapers swept by the breeze. Jeremiah sat on the edge of his plywood bed, the soles of his boots planted square on the cold concrete. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, staring down at his feet as if waiting for something to give him permission. He exhaled slowly, the breath catching in his chest before leaving in a sharp puff of white mist. Then he reached down and began to unlace the left boot. The motions were deliberate, like a ritual he hadn't performed in years. The laces were frayed, darkened from time and weather. The leather creaked as he pulled the tongue forward, revealing a sock that had worn thin at the heel. But he wasn't after the boot itself. He was after what lay beneath, it hidden, forgotten, but never quite out of mind. Jeremiah turned the boot over, and pressed his thumb against the arch of the sole. There was a faint seam, nearly invisible, but it gave way with a push. The rubber peeled back slowly, revealing a shallow compartment lined with a layer of worn duct tape. Carefully, he reached inside and withdrew a small object no larger than his thumb. A black flash drive coated in dust and time. He held it in his palm for a moment, the weight of it almost laughably light for what it carried. He hadn't touched it since 2013, not since the day he left Walter Reed for the last time, not since he made the decision to disappear into silence. The drive wasn't labeled. No stickers, no marks, just a plastic casing, smoothed down by friction and the warmth of being pressed against him for years. He used to check on it every few months, just to be sure it hadn't cracked or corroded. But after a while, he stopped. Life on the street didn't leave much room for sentiment. Still, he never let it go. Inside that drive were three things. The first was a complete after-action report from Operation Grey Ember, classified beyond top secret, never entered into official Army logs. It detailed the chain of command's failure to extract Jeremiah's unit before the ambush, the ignored satellite warnings, and the civilian interference that nearly cost all of them their lives. Jeremiah had copied it against orders not to expose anyone, but because he knew the day might come when truth would matter more than loyalty. The second was a recording grainy audio, taken from his own helmet cam, capturing the voice of a senior official directing them to hold position regardless of casualties. The voice was calm, bureaucratic, but to anyone who'd served, it was damning. Jeremiah had listened to it once, late at night in the barracks, before locking it away. He hadn't played it since. The third item was a letter, not typed scanned. A handwritten letter from one of the 12 men he'd saved. Staff Sergeant Elias Grant. Grant had died 2 years later from complications linked to his injuries. But before he passed, he wrote Jeremiah to say thank you, and not just for pulling him from the blast zone. He thanked him for giving his children a father for 2 more years, for giving him time to say goodbye properly. The letter was never mailed. Jeremiah found it folded into the lining of Grant's locker during the cleanup. He scanned it, archived it, and never told a soul. Now, he stared at the drive. It surfaced dull in the weak light of the alley. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. But calling Beckett meant this part of Himtha, one that still had proof. Memory receipts was no longer something he could keep buried. If things had begun moving, then so had this. He reached back into his duffel and pulled out the small, zippered pouch where he kept what few valuables he still trusted. He slipped the drive inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, then zipped it shut again. Carefully, he slid the boot back on, resealed the sole, and laced it tight. There was no ceremony, no dramatic gesture, just a man sitting quietly in the dark, holding on to something that the world had tried very hard to forget. The past hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting. The soft crunch of gravel under cautious footsteps was the only sound that marked her arrival. Jeremiah didn't look up at first. He recognized the rhythm of her approach, measured, confident, not the kind of gait you developed by accident. She didn't call out, didn't ask permission to enter the alley where he'd carved out a square of peace for himself. She simply stopped a few feet away and waited. After a long moment, Jeremiah raised his head. She was dressed in dark slacks and a weatherproof blazer, her boots worn but well cared for, the kind of outfit someone wore when they needed to walk. Between boardrooms and bus stops without being questioned, in her hands, a leather portfolio. "Nina," he said, his voice low and dry. She nodded once, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Jeremiah. Milk crate across from him, not much of an office. "It'll do," she replied, settling into the makeshift seat without complaint. She placed the portfolio gently on the flat surface between them and another crate. This one covered in a layer of cardboard and a folded towel he used as a table. Sat for a moment in silence, the air between them carrying the weight of too much unsaid. Nina had met men like him before, had sat on park benches, soup kitchen tables, hospital beds, always with that same thin line between offering help and offering pity. She never crossed it. Finally, she opened the folder and slid it across the makeshift table. "It's all here," she said, "if you want it." Jeremiah didn't reach for it right away. His fingers hovered, then withdrew. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "Redemption," she said, or something like it. Inside the folder was a packet of documents, some familiar, Most not. A formal appeal drafted for VA review. Backed by medical and psychological evaluations, Nina's team had assembled over the last 72 hours. Attached to it, a reinstated benefits request with priority status, flagged by someone high enough to override the months-long backlog. And underneath that, an offer from a private contractor, tied to an old defense colleague of General Beckett's, requesting Jeremiah's insight on combat zone field navigation, an advisory role, remote, part-time, high pay. Jeremiah looked up at her, searching her face for any sign of strings. "I don't need a pity job," he said, steady but quiet. "This isn't pity," she replied. "It's recognition and a chance to speak on your own terms." He turned his attention back to the folder. She flipped another page. This section outlines an option to reopen your Silver Star. Commendation publicly this time, press conference. Optional, you can decline, but the department wants to reissue it formally with honors. Jeremiah's jaw tightened slightly. He shook his head once. They didn't care when it mattered. They do now because of a video. "No," Nina said calmly, "because you finally called someone who never stopped caring." He leaned back slightly, hands resting in his lap. The folder stayed closed, his fingers never quite touching it. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. Nina gave a half smile, not condescending, just understanding. "I know you survived it instead, but this isn't about asking. This is about reclaiming." She let the words settle. "You can say no. Nothing here forces you back into the world. But if you sign, you get housing permanent, not transitional. Full medical, mental health support, with a team that answers only to you. A clean record in every database that matters, and the authority to erase that video from anywhere it ever existed. All legal. All binding." Jeremiah finally reached forward and rested his hand on the folder. He didn't open it, just sat there breathing it in. "What if I'm not ready?" he asked. "Then I'll come back tomorrow," she said. She stood slowly, brushing off the back of her coat. "The world owes you something, Sergeant Cole. This folder is just one small part of it. Take your time, I'll be nearby." And then, just like that, she walked back the way she came. Quiet, measured, and without fanfare. Jeremiah stayed seated long after she disappeared from view, his hand still resting on the folder like it was something fragile. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he felt the weight of a burden or the weight of something being lifted. The water hit his skin like a memory, sharp, almost painful, and so foreign, it made him inhale through his teeth. It had been months since Jeremiah Cole felt water that wasn't from a gas station sink or a passing rainstorm. The shower in the transitional housing facility sputtered for a second, then settled into a steady rhythm. Steam slowly curling through the corners of the small tiled stall. He stood there, motionless at first, letting the warmth trace the curve of his spine, his neck, the scar that curved around his shoulder and vanished beneath the jagged edge of an old burn. He didn't scrub, not immediately, just existed. Still, bare upright under something that didn't judge him, when he finally reached for the soap, his hands trembled not from weakness but from the sensation of not feeling dirt layered over skin. The lather ran brown down his legs. More than just the grime of the street came off. It felt like he was washing off a version of himself that had calcified over time, one forged in alleyways, train stations, and the back corners of forgotten shelters. He lingered longer than necessary, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know when he'd allow himself this again. Even now, knowing Beckett had made the arrangements, knowing Nina had filed the papers and set the terms, there was a part of him that believed this was temporary, that it could vanish with a single wrong breath. Eventually, he turned off the water. The silence that followed felt deafening. He stepped out onto the cheap rubber mat and wrapped himself in the coarse institutional towel they'd left for him, his clothes fresh ones. Folded neatly on the bench, smelled like starch and unfamiliar detergent. Jeans, t-shirt, a pair of compression socks, nothing military issue, nothing flashy. But clean dot when he walked out of the bathroom, his boots old, worn, and still with the hidden flash drive in the Solsat beside the fresh pair of slip-on sneakers the intake volunteer had suggested. He ignored the new shoes. Across the hall, the room was small but private. A bed, a dresser, a mirror above the sink that was bolted to the wall, just like in the barracks. No pictures, no echoes of a life lived before this one. But the silence inside was different than the alley. It was deliberate. Jeremiah approached the mirror slowly. What looked back at him wasn't the man he remembered. The beard was gone now, trimmed down by a volunteer nurse named Elsie, who'd offered a razor and a kind smile without questions. The eyes were heavier, sunken in a way no sleep could cure. Gray flecked through the stubble on his jaw. His cheeks were thinner than he remembered, but his shoulders still broad. His posture still carried that faint residual discipline that never quite leaves a soldier. He leaned closer, bracing himself against the sink. The scar near his temple he'd gotten that in Kandahar. The broken cartilage in his nose came from a fall in Tikrit. The small nick under his eye, that one was just from a broken bottle in an alley behind a liquor store in Denver during a night that didn't deserve remembering. And behind all that, in the deep recess of his eyes, was a man who had once commanded respect, held lives in his hands, and made decisions in seconds that others couldn't fathom in lifetimes. Now, he wasn't sure what remained of that man. He reached for the edge of the mirror, not to adjust it, but almost to test if it was real. The coolness of the metal edge grounded him. A knock came at the door. Not hard, not urgent. He turned slightly. "Yeah," the voice was soft. "Nina, just wanted to say they've stocked the kitchen downstairs. You're welcome to grab something. When you're ready." He didn't respond right away. "I'll come down," he said eventually, as her footsteps faded. He looked at his reflection one last time. Then he straightened up, pulled on the clean shirt, and tucked his dog tags underneath. They clinked quietly against his chest. Still there, still solid. Proof of something. Not everything, but enough to move forward. The knock on the door was steady, no hesitation. Jeremiah had just finished folding the extra blanket at the foot of the bed. A habit, not a necessity. The mattress was still foreign to him, too soft, too even but. The motion of folding the blanket was something that felt familiar, like sweeping sand from a tent flap, like checking his rifle's barrel before sunrise. Some things stayed, no matter how many years passed. He glanced at the door, then opened it without a word. The man standing there wore a dark blue uniform with a badge on the chest and a radio clipped to the shoulder. His hair was shorter than Jeremiah remembered, a little more silver, but the smile was unmistakable wide, relieved, full of the kind of warmth you don't fake. "Jesus," the man said, "you're alive." Jeremiah didn't smile, not right away. He just blinked once, slowly, as if he were seeing a mirage that might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Reyes," he said finally. The man stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Jeremiah in a tight, sudden hug. No ceremony, no preamble, just forceful affection, like someone who had missed an entire person for years. Jeremiah let himself be hugged, a beat, then another. Then he brought a hand up and clapped Reyes on the back. "We thought you were gone, man," Reyes said when they pulled apart. "Years. I mean, we heard things. Someone said you were up in Chicago. Another guy swore he saw you in El Paso, limping out of a shelter. But no one really knew." Jeremiah gestured toward the room, stepping aside. Reyes entered, looking around, quickly, not like a cop, more like a brother trying to take in the changes. "Nice place," he said, half smiling. "Better than the back of a supply truck." Jeremiah gave a quiet snort and nodded. Fewer rats. They sat down, Reyes in the single chair near the small desk, Jeremiah on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The years sat between them like a third person. Not unwelcome, just present. "You got thinner," Reyes said finally. "So did you." "No, man, you got thin, like ghost-level thin." Jeremiah shrugged. "Street food diet. Not recommended." There was a silence again. Then Reyes reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. He laid it on the desk, turned toward Jeremiah. He knew the photo, 8 men, arms slung around each other's shoulders in a sun-scorched desert outpost. Dust on their faces, laughter in their eyes. The background was blurred, just sandbags and barbed wire, but their smiles were sharp, real. "Before the explosion, before it all came apart, remember that day?" Reyes asked, voice quieter now. Jeremiah nodded. "We ran out of clean water 2 hours after that. Yeah, and Carter got heatstroke trying to impress that reporter from base." Jeremiah's mouth twitched into something like a smile. That guy couldn't spell combat if it was stenciled on his vest. They both chuckled softly. The kind of laugh that hurts a little. The kind that only comes from shared blood, dust, and silence. Reyes cleared his throat. "I wish you'd reached out sooner," he said. "We would have come for you, any of us. You know that, right? I didn't want to be found." "Well," Reyes said, tapping the photo, "that didn't stop us from looking." Jeremiah looked at the photo again, then back up. "Why now?" Reyes leaned forward. "Beckett called me," he said. "Said you were ready to come in from the cold. Told me to come down here. Make sure you remembered who you still had on your side." Jeremiah sat back, nodding slowly. He always did know how to play the long game. "And you?" Reyes asked. "You ready to come back?" "I'm not who I was." "None of us are," Reyes said. "But who you were still matters. That guy saved my life. Twice. I never forgot that." Jeremiah swallowed hard, throat thick with things he hadn't said in a decade. "I thought maybe they all moved on." "They did," Reyes said, "but that doesn't mean they left you behind. We're not done with you yet, brother." And for the first time since that alley, since the laughter, since the Kol Jeremiah, didn't feel invisible, he felt seen, remembered, and maybe, just maybe, he felt a little bit home. The television in the common room wasn't large, and the sound was kept low to avoid complaints from other residents, but the image was unmistakable. Jeremiah's face caught mid-glance, looking down at his sign on the sidewalk, flashed on the screen, alongside bold text that read, "Homeless veteran, mocked by teens turns out to be decorated war hero." Someone had snapped the photo. Without his knowledge, probably one of the nurses or volunteers at the shelter. It had already been picked up by 2 local stations and 1 regional affiliate. The news anchor's voice was gentle, almost reverent. "Tonight, a man many passed by without a second glance is being recognized as a hero." Jeremiah Cole, a former Sergeant and Silver Star recipient, was mocked by a group of young men earlier this week. What those boys didn't realize was that they were laughing at a man whose service once saved 12 lives during a brutal ambush in Afghanistan. In the corner of the screen, they showed a clip from his award citation, overlaid with blurred footage of the sidewalk outside the gas station, the SUV, the laughter. The moment someone threw a crumpled bill in his direction like he was a street prop. The footage was viral, now edited and reposted with headlines like, "You won't believe who this homeless man is," and "Real American hero gets the last word." But Jeremiah wasn't speaking. He sat quietly at the back of the room, hands folded in his lap, eyes on the floor. Nina had warned him the press would come knocking. She had offered to field all requests, run interference. He hadn't given her a formal answer then, just a nod, just silence. Now the requests had begun. Reporters had called the shelter. A man from a morning talk show left a handwritten note with one of the volunteers. A podcast host with military credentials offered to fly in that weekend for a sit-down. There were emails, phone calls, even one woman who drove all the way from Baltimore and waited outside the building with a bouquet of red, white, and blue carnations. She held a sign that read, "We see you, SGT Cole." But still, he said nothing. To the cameras, not to the microphones, not to the questions that came disguised as kindness. Nina found him later that afternoon in the hallway outside the laundry room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. She didn't push, just stood beside him, mirroring his posture, eyes facing forward. "They're not going to stop," she said gently. "The story's out now." "I didn't ask for a story," he replied. "I know, they want me to perform," he added. "Put on the uniform, say something inspiring, make people feel good about themselves." Nina waited, giving him space. "I'm not ready," he said finally. "Not yet." She nodded slowly. "Then we don't do anything. You decide when or if. Until then, I'll keep redirecting." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I'm not afraid of the attention," he said. "That's not it. I know it's not. It's just the story they want to hear. It's not the one I've lived. They want medals. They want redemption arcs. They don't want to hear about VA waitlists or sleeping with one eye open under a bridge or waking up from dreams that make your hands shake." Nina turned her head toward him. "Then when you're ready, you tell your story. On your terms." Jeremiah didn't respond, but the tightness in his jaw eased slightly. Later that night, he passed the common room again. The news had moved on to other things: traffic accidents, weather warnings, local sports. His image was gone, replaced by the slow churn of headlines and ticker tape. He stood there for a moment, looking at the blankness of it all. The world had noticed him briefly, but what they wanted wasn't him, not really. They wanted a symbol, and Jeremiah Cole had never been comfortable being a symbol. He had spent too many years just trying to be a man. So he turned off the television, walked back to his room, and sat in the quiet. Outside, the noise would continue. Inside, he waited for the right time, for a voice that felt like his own. The office was sterile, in the way corporate spaces always seemed to be: neutral tones, chrome fixtures, a faint scent of coffee and toner hanging in the air. Jeremiah sat across from a man in a navy suit who looked like he hadn't seen a battlefield in his life, but knew how to speak like he had. There was a confidence in his tone, the kind that came from being told you were important by other important people. He smiled too much, leaned too far forward, and used Jeremiah's first name like they'd known each other for years. "Look, Sergeant Cole, we understand your reservations," the man said, "but this isn't deployment. This is insight, strategy. You'd be behind a desk remote, if you prefer. Reviewing intel, advising teams on the ground. You'd never have to touch a weapon." Jeremiah didn't reply immediately. His eyes wandered around the room toward the framed photo of a group of contractors in tactical gear, posing in front of a desert compound, their faces blurred out for anonymity. Toward the plaque on the wall commemorating a decade of excellence in risk mitigation and tactical consultancy. Toward the glass of bottled water he hadn't touched. The offer was clear: a consulting position, 6 figures, flexible hours, government contracts, full medical coverage, including PTSD support, the kind of job most people would kill, for especially someone with a service record like his. Jeremiah finally leaned back in the chair, his hand resting lightly on the armrest. "I didn't call because I needed work," he said. The man nodded, but his smile faltered. Of course, but it's a way to re-engage, a way to," Jeremiah cut him off. "Called because I was tired." The room fell quiet. "I called because I was tired of hiding." He paused, his voice steady, not angry. "You want me to apply that mark like a lesson plan? Package it for your clients. But I don't want to relive it for someone else's bottom line." The man's brow furrowed slightly. "I already did." "That," Jeremiah said, 12 times, by my count. The silence returned, heavier this time. He stood slowly, picking up his jacket from the back of the chair. The man across from him stood as well, but less certainly. "You sure you want to walk away from this?" he asked. Jeremiah nodded once. "I'm not walking away. I'm choosing not to go back." Outside the building, the wind had picked up. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Jeremiah paused beside a row of hedges and exhaled deeply, as if shedding something that had clung to him since the moment he stepped inside. He wasn't angry. He understood the offer. It made sense on paper. He had skills that were rare, valuable, even necessary in the world of private conflict resolution. But that world was built on adrenaline and constant tension, on extracting knowledge from trauma and turning it into profitable doctrine. And Jeremiah had lived with that tension long enough. What he wanted now wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't redemption in the eyes of a contractor or a paycheck padded with hazard bonuses. What he wanted, what he needed, was rest. Space to remember who he was before the ambush, before the medals. With its usual indifference, somewhere behind him, someone else would take the job. Someone younger, or someone still clinging to the identity the war had given them. Jeremiah sat on the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't chasing. The next mission, he was listening for his own voice, for his own rhythm. And in that quiet space between offers and obligations, he was finally beginning to hear it. The air in the park was still. Not silent, exactly. There were birds somewhere up in the branches. Jeremiah sat with his back straight, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes forward but unfocused. He hadn't asked for this meeting. He hadn't refused it either. When Beckett's contact suggested a controlled setting, Jeremiah had simply said, "If they come, they come." At the other end of the paved path, a black SUV pulled up. The same one, though this time the windows were clear and the doors opened slowly. Trey stepped out first, followed by the other three. None of them spoke, none of them smiled. No chains, no laughter, the performance was gone. What remained was discomfort, uncertainty, and the weight of something they couldn't name yet. A man in a suit accompanied them halfway down the path, then stopped and motioned them forward. This part they had to do alone. Move when they approached. He didn't acknowledge them beyond the slow blink of someone watching shadows change shape. Trey cleared his throat softly. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know who you were." Jeremiah's gaze didn't shift. "You still don't." The boys stood there, unsure of what to do with their hands, their eyes, their shame. One of them reached into his jacket as if holding something, maybe a note. Trey said, stumbling, "I lost that for a minute. We were being stupid, just trying to be funny." Jeremiah finally turned his head. "Funny," he said flatly. Trey swallowed. "It wasn't." "I know that now." Jeremiah leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows. On his knees, his voice was low. "Even, do you know what I remember most from that day?" Trey shook his head. "I remember your voice," Jeremiah said. "Not a man, not a person, just something to laugh at." The youngest of the group looked down at his shoes. Another shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the car like he wished he could disappear. "I've been shot at," Jeremiah continued. "Watched friends bleed out in dirt, pulled bodies out of burning vehicles. And still, the thing that stuck with me that day wasn't any of that. It was the way you looked at me, like I was less than nothing. Like I was in your way." Trey looked like he wanted to speak again, but held it. "I don't need an apology," Jeremiah said after a pause. "Apologies are easy. They make you feel better. Not me. Then why are we here?" Trey asked quietly. "To learn," Jeremiah said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notepad. "People I served with, one of them never made it home. The others aren't doing so well. PTSD, substance issues, isolation. You think what happened between us is unique. It isn't. You think I'm the only one on a bench like this? Look again." Trey read the names. They didn't mean anything to him. Not yet, but they would. "I want you to research them," Jeremiah said. "Learn who they are, what they did. Then find a way to give back. Volunteer, write something, speak. Don't let your apology end in this park." They stood in silence again. "Can we come back? If you come with better questions." As they turned to leave, Trey looked back over his shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "Jeremiah." They didn't answer, not with words. And sometimes, beginnings are all we get. The lobby smelled like instant coffee and old carpet. Flyers lined the walls. Group therapy schedules, AA meetings, job fairs. No one seemed to attend. A few veterans sat scattered among the plastic chairs, eyes half closed, waiting for their turn with the intake worker, or maybe just passing time until the next free lunch. Jeremiah stood near the entrance, taking it all in. The ceiling tiles were yellowed with time. The vending machine hummed unevenly. Not this exact center, but enough like it that the details blended in endless pattern of spaces that meant well, but ran on fumes. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it wasn't enough. He watched a man limp past him, his left pant leg pinned where a knee used to be. Another man argued with the receptionist over a missed appointment, voice rising and cracking as frustration outpaced dignity. A younger staffer approached him with a clipboard. Her eyes were kind but tired. "Double quotes, sir? Are you checking?" And Jeremiah glanced at the clipboard, then shook his head. "No, just looking around." She hesitated, unsure whether to press further, then nodded and moved on. He walked slowly past the couches and coffee station, past the bulletin board filled with promises that had long expired. A sign above the hallway read, "Resource Room," but the door beneath it was locked, a handwritten note taped over it, computer down, printer out of order. "Sorry for the inconvenience." He stood there for a moment, staring at the door. Nina met him at the front steps as he exited. She'd waited in the car, giving him space. When he sat beside her, he didn't speak immediately, just stared out across the parking lot toward the strip mall across the street. "Thoughts?" she asked. Jeremiah's voice was soft. "This could be better." Nina nodded. "Yeah, it could." They said they had secured funding discreetly. No media attention for infrastructure improvements, new staff hires, equipment upgrades, and the launch of a peer mentorship program. The amount wasn't disclosed publicly, but it was enough. To replace every cracked chair, install a new computer lab, expand the counseling team, and create a fully stocked clothing and hygiene closet for walk-in veterans. No one knew where the funding came from. The paperwork was routed through a nonprofit based out of DC. But the nonprofit had no website, no board listed, no press history, just a P.O. box and a legal name that translated to something obscure: Solace Group, LLC. The funds cleared. Within days, contractors were on site by the end of the week. Jeremiah returned just as the new flooring was being installed. The vending machines had been replaced by a coffee bar run by volunteers. The television now cycled through digital announcements for upcoming programs, guest speakers, and job placement services. The receptionist, same one as before, a genuine smile when she saw him. "Did you see?" she asked. "Someone must have heard you." Jeremiah offered a small shrug. Maybe they did. In the corner of the main room where the old plastic chairs used to be, now stood a row of cushioned seats arranged around a low table filled with military memoirs, pamphlets, and even a few dog-eared copies of the things they carried. A young vet in his 20s sat there reading, nodding along to something only he understood. Jeremiah made his way down the hall. The resource room door was open now, buzzing with activity. Two men worked on updating resumes. A staffer explained VA forms, and someone in the back printed out a bus schedule for a veteran starting a new job the following week. He didn't stay. Long outside, Nina waited again. When he slid into the passenger seat, she glanced over. "You didn't sign in?" Jeremiah shook his head. "Didn't come for services." "What did you come for?" He looked back at the building, then ahead, to see if it started working. She nodded, understanding more than his words could say. Jeremiah didn't want credit. He didn't want recognition or a plaque on the wall. He just wanted one real place, where people like him didn't have to ask twice, where dignity didn't cost extra. And for the first time in a long while, he thought maybe that place was beginning to exist. It was just after 7 when Jeremiah heard the knock. Not the sharp, urgent kind that signals trouble, but the familiar rhythm of someone who means no harm is used to waiting. He opened the door and found Nina standing there with 2 coffees in hand and a folder tucked under her arm. Her blazer looked slept in, and there was a smudge of ink on her wrist, half wiped away. She'd been working late again. That much was clear. He stepped aside without a word, and she entered like she had before, comfortable, focused, always slightly ahead of her own thoughts. "I've been sketching something out," she said, setting the coffees on the counter and flipping open the folder. "And I want to run it by you." Jeremiah leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She handed him a page with color-coded boxes and a rough layout of a building. "What am I looking at?" "A new facility," Nina said. "Not another clinic. Not a one-size-fits-all shelter. I'm thinking something different, peer-led, community-driven, a hybrid between transitional housing, rehab support, and real-world job training. No gatekeeping, no endless waiting rooms. Just people who've been through it, helping those who are still in it." Jeremiah's eyes scanned the paper. There were sections labeled workshops, peer council offices, and on-site apprenticeships. In the corner, someone had scribbled "night-only safe room, quiet zone" in blue pen, as if it had come to them in the middle of an unrelated task. "You're trying to fix the whole system," he said. "I'm trying to patch one part of it," she replied. "But I want to do it right, which means I can't build it from a boardroom." Jeremiah looked at her, waiting. "I need someone who knows what the street feels like, who's lived the in-between, who understands how fast things can fall apart, how slow the recovery is." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat down at the table, turning the page sideways, seeing how the rooms would flow together. "You want me to be your what?" he asked. "Consultant. Mascot?" Nina shook her head. "Your name doesn't even have to be on it, if you don't want it to be. I just need your brain, your experience. I need you to walk through this space with Minot, on paper, but when it's real. I need you to tell me when it feels right, or when it doesn't." Jeremiah leaned back in the chair. His expression didn't shift, but his fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the paper. "You think people are ready for that?" he asked. "I think people are desperate for that," she said. "The current system runs on waiting lists and polite rejection. We need something that moves, something shaped by the people it's meant to serve. And you've got backing for this." "I will," she said. Some of the same silent hands that helped with the resource center upgrades are willing to do more, but only if the plan's real. Grounded, I can't give them just architectural blueprints and non-profit buzzwords. I have to give them a soul. Jeremiah looked back down at the page. Tell me about the workshops, he said, her eyes lit up. Basic construction, welding, electrical, IT support, small engine repair, taught by vets who've done the work. And every participant leaves with certifications, real ones. Employers will know their training means something. And those who aren't ready for that yet, we have support tracks, recovery coaching, mental health, peer navigators, not just people with degrees, people with scars. He nodded slowly in the night-only safe room for those who aren't ready to stay. Who need a place to breathe. No intake forms, no forced referrals. Just a cot, a lock on the door, and quiet. Jeremiah exhaled. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a ribbon-cutting moment, but it sounded like something real, something useful. He looked up again. You build it. I'll walk it. Nina didn't smile right away. She just nodded, like she'd already made space for that answer. In her plan, it'll take time. I've got some now, he said. She closed the folder gently. The second coffee was still warm. Neither of them had touched it yet. Outside, the city moved past, different and loud. But inside the table, between them had become something else. Not just a workspace, not just a planning zone. It had become a place where survival turned into structure, and where the future, however uncertain, no longer had to arrive empty-handed. The next time Nina stopped by, she didn't bring coffee or folders. She just brought herself, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, like she already expected the conversation. To get messy, Jeremiah was seated on the back steps of the transitional unit, the concrete still warm from the late afternoon sun. A small notebook rested on his knee. He wasn't writing, just holding it, thumbs sliding over the edge like he was waiting for a reason to open it. She didn't ask if he'd thought about the offer. She knew he had. The way he'd lingered on the workshop layout. The way he'd traced the flow of space with his finger. That wasn't idle curiosity. That was someone already imagining the walls, already hearing the voices that might fill them. I'll do it, Jeremiah said, without looking at her. Nina exhaled not a dramatic sigh of relief, but something smaller, quieter, like she'd been holding her breath and didn't even know it. But, he added, it's got to include two things. Non-negotiable. She sat on the step beside him. Go on first, he said. A mental health wing, not a closet with pamphlets. A full wing, staffed. And not just people with degrees. People who've sat on curbs with nowhere to go. People who've talked themselves down from the edge. People who won't flinch when someone says, I don't know if I want to wake up. Tomorrow, Nina nodded, already tracking. Second, Jeremiah continued a hotline. Late night, real people answering, no elevator music, no automated menus. Because that's when it gets bad, not noon, not when the sun's up and the city's busy. It's at 2 a.m. when everything's quiet and your brain starts rewinding the worst parts on a loop. He paused and looked at her now. I know that's when it got bad for me. Nina didn't write anything down. She just listened. I remember one night, Jeremiah said, I was under the overpass off Jefferson, cold as hell. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, couldn't sleep. Every sound felt like a threat. And I started thinking if I just slipped into traffic, real quiet, it'd be done. Easy. His voice wasn't shaky. It was matter. But then I remembered a number someone had scribbled on a napkin and stuck in my pocket. Said it was some vet's peer line. I called. Some guy named Marcus picked up, didn't ask for my social, didn't ask what branch or year, just said, "What's going on, man?" Like he'd been waiting for me to call. He looked forward again. We talked for an hour. I never met him after that. Don't even know if he's still working there. But that call bought me another day. Nina reached over and rested her hand on the notebook in his lap. Then we build that, and we don't lock it behind insurance, Jeremiah said. We don't make people prove they're broken enough. If someone says they need help, that's enough. Agreed. They sat in silence a little longer. A breeze picked up, rustling the pages of his notebook, though he hadn't opened it. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere inside, a volunteer was shouting that dinner would be served in 20. Jeremiah finally opened the notebook. A blank page stared back. He clicked a pen from his pocket and scribbled something at the top. What are you writing? Nina asked. Names, he said. She waited. People I want, working that hotline, or at least training those who do. People I trust. He didn't say more, and she didn't press. Later that evening, when she left, he stayed out there a while. Longer, writing names, then notes beside the names. Then questions he thought might matter. Not bureaucratic questions, human ones. When Nina drove away, she passed him again, still seated on the steps, still writing slowly. And she realized, even without him saying it, that his yes wasn't just permission, it was ownership. He wasn't stepping into her plan. He was beginning to build his own. The hallway of the storage facilities smelled faintly of dust and old rubber. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the concrete floor. Jeremiah walked slowly, his limp more pronounced in the chill of the enclosed space. He stopped in front of Unit 1 to 4B, an old combination padlock clinging to the latch like it hadn't been touched in years. He stared at it for a long moment, then pulled a key from his coat pocket, the only key that had never left his person. Even when he had nothing else worth locking up, the metal clicked, reluctant at first, then gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow space filled with silence and shadows. There wasn't much inside, a few broken-down furniture pieces, a duffel bag full of training manuals. But in the far corner sat a single weatherproof container, black and scuffed, with a military-grade clasp across the front. He dragged it to the center and knelt, ignoring the sting in his knee as it touched the cold floor. The latch opened with a pop and a sigh, like the box itself had been holding its breath. Inside, carefully arranged, was a jacket, dark blue, crisp, faintly scented of cedar from an old moth repellent, sachet tucked inside the collar, his dress blues pressed and folded. With care, he hadn't worn them since the funeral 10 years ago, the day they folded the flag and handed it to his daughter's trembling hands. She was 15 then, eyes red, back straight like she was holding up the sky. He ran a hand along the fabric. The silver star pinned to the left chest was still in place, along with the stripes, the campaign ribbons, the insignia, everything exactly where it should be. But it felt like it belonged to someone else now, a different man, one who still believed in the tidy narrative of sacrifice and gratitude. He reached deeper into the box and pulled out a small wooden case, the kind used to preserve medals. Inside, the contents looked untouched commendations, service coins. A few photographs faded at the edges. One showed him with his unit arms slung over shoulders, desert wind in their faces. All of them smiling, not because they were happy, but because they were together, and together was rare. And then there was the flag, folded into a perfect triangle, edges sharp, the stars clean and symmetrical against a field of deep navy. He lifted it with both hands, his fingers tracing the edge where his daughter's hands had once smoothed it into place. She had insisted on folding it herself, with the chaplain guiding her step by step. He remembered the way her jaw clenched when she saluted too young for it, too small in that oversized black coat, but she had done it anyway. He sat back against the wall and held the flag in his lap. That day hadn't been for a comrade or a brother-in-arms. It had been for his father, a Vietnam vet who never quite got out of the jungle, even when he came home. The flag had rested on his coffin at the veteran cemetery just outside Arlington. Jeremiah had wanted to say something then, but the words wouldn't come. And when the ceremony ended, and his daughter placed the folded flag into the box herself, she had simply whispered, "I'll keep it safe." He had nodded, too proud to cry. Now, 10 years later, he realized she had kept that promise. The fabric had not frayed. The corners had not loosened. The weight of it was the same as it had always been, light in form, heavy in meaning. Jeremiah didn't know why he had come for it now. Maybe because the new center, whatever it would become, needed its own beginning. Not just a funding plan or blueprints, but a memory, a root, something sacred. He slid the jacket back into the box, pressed the metals flat, and placed the flag on top, like sealing a letter he'd finally found the words for. He didn't lock the box again. Instead, he closed it gently and carried it under one arm. As he walked back through the corridor, the past wasn't a burden anymore. It was a tool, heavy, yes, but useful, honed by fire and held together by thread brass and folded cloth. He walked out into the light. The envelope was cream-colored. and slightly bent at one corner, like it had been handled more than once before reaching him. There was no return address, only a neat line of handwriting in dark ink that simply said to Dad. Jeremiah stood with it in hand for a while before opening it. He was alone on the back porch of the transitional house, watching shadows stretch. Across the yard, as the sun dipped low, his fingers hesitated at the flap, rough skin catching against paper that felt too clean. Too new. He had imagined this moment before, though never exactly like this. Sometimes in restless sleep or on long walks with no destination. He'd allowed himself to picture her face, not the 15-year-old girl who saluted at her grandfather's funeral, but the woman she might have become. He hadn't seen her. In nearly a decade, their last words had not been warm ones. He unfolded the letter with the care of someone unwrapping something fragile. The handwriting was steady, not rushed. It began simply, "Hi, Dad. I saw your face on the news last week. At first, I wasn't even sure it was you, but I kept watching, and something in me just knew. You looked older and tired, but also not lost, not the way I used to think of you." Jeremiah read the words slowly, lips barely moving. "I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. I never hated you. I just didn't understand. I didn't understand what the war did to you, or what it meant to come back to a country that moved on without you. I didn't understand why you couldn't stay, why you pulled away, why it felt like I was always chasing someone who didn't want to be caught." He closed his eyes for a second, pressing the letter to his chest before continuing. "I know now that it wasn't about me, and I'm sorry for thinking it was. I think I wanted you to be the version of Dad I saw in movies. Strong, constant, always there. But real life isn't like that. Real people are complicated, and you had wounds I couldn't see. Your story on the news, hearing what you did, what you survived, made me realize how much I didn't know. Not just about you, but about the kind of strength it takes to keep going when everything tells you to give up. You were hurting, and I judged you instead of trying to understand you." He reached the end of the page and found another folded behind it. "If you're willing, I'd like to see you. No cameras, no press, just us. I don't need a perfect reunion. I just want to talk, maybe sit on a bench somewhere and share coffee like we used to. I've kept the photo of us at the beach. I still have the little necklace you bought me from that boardwalk cart. Remember that? I think you spent all your per diem money on it. You said it looked like something a warrior princess would wear. Well, I'm trying to be that now. Brave, honest, reaching back instead of waiting forever. I hope this reaches you. I hope you read it. And I hope, more than anything, that you write back. Love." Elinaj Ramier stared at the closing signature. He hadn't said her name aloud in years, not even to himself. Saying it now felt like pulling a breath from the bottom of his lungs. He folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, then sat still for a long time. The yard was quiet. A wind chime tinkled faintly nearby. A train passed in the distance. The low rumble a reminder that the world hadn't paused just for him. He didn't have the words yet. Not all of them, but he knew he would find them, and when he did, he'd start with one that had never been said enough. "Thank you." The room was sleek and modern, all polished wood and brushed steel, with bottled water lined up like soldiers at each seat. The state capitol building had recently undergone renovations, and it showed clean walls, discreet lighting, and a sense of purpose that hummed through the HVAC system like white noise. Jeremiah had never been in a space quite like it. He had worn his dress blues once to a military banquet long ago, but this felt different, less ceremonial, more clinical. At the long oval table sat 15 other state officials, policy advisors, nonprofit executives, and 2 senators who had flown in for the event. Their tailored suits fit snug across their shoulders, lapel pins flashing like small medals of bureaucracy. Each of them had a laptop or tablet open, some with color-coded notes or slides prepared. Jeremiah had brought nothing but his hands, which rested folded in his lap. He wore a simple gray-collared shirt and the black jacket Nina had helped him find just last week's oft wool. Secondhand but sharp. His boots were polished, though they still bore the creases of 1,000 miles walked. His name card read, Jeremiah Cole, Veteran Advocate Peer. A moderator stood at the head of the table, thanking everyone for attending the quarterly roundtable. On Veterans Affairs, Jeremiah listened as they spoke about budget reallocations, transitional housing metrics, opioid recovery trends. He nodded occasionally, taking it in, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Midway through, the moderator gestured toward him. "Mr. Cole, thank you for joining us. I believe you had something to share on the subject of housing outcomes." He looked up slowly, then stood not abruptly, not for drama, but out of habit. When addressing a room stand, it was something drilled into him long before his discharge. "Won't talk long," he began, "but I'll say what I came to say." The room fell silent. "I was homeless for 7 years," he said, voice even. "Not couch surfing, not in some temporary place waiting for a lease to kick in. I mean real homeless. Sidewalks, underpasses, winter in a cardboard lean-to, summer under mosquito swarms. I know what it feels like when your whole world fits into a backpack." A few people nodded. Most just listened. "I know what it's like to wake up and not remember which city you're in. To eat from garbage cans one night and get turned away from a shelter the next because you didn't have a clean intake sheet. I know what it's like when a stranger steps over you like you're part of the pavement." He let the silence settle before continuing. "And I also know what gets people off the street. It's not always a voucher. It's not always a job fair. Sometimes it's a phone that answers at 2 a.m. Sometimes it's one who doesn't treat you like a case file. Someone across from him cleared their throat. Another scribbled a note. I'm not here to shame anyone. He said, I know you work hard. I know your hands are tied half the time by legislation written 3 administrations ago, but I'm asking you to remember something. He looked around the table, making eye contact without flinching. Not problems to be solved. We are people. Some of us wore the uniform longer than others. Some came home with ribbons. Some came home with scars. Some didn't come home at all. And for those of us who did, don't make us climb another battlefield just to prove we're worth helping. Mr. Cole, are you suggesting a change in how we do intake assessments, or? I'm suggesting, Jeremiah interrupted gently, that you start by sitting where I sat. That you walk through a shelter at midnight without announcing yourself. That you try surviving on nothing for a week in the city you govern. You'll learn more than you ever will from another PowerPoint. No one laughed, but the message landed. He sat down slowly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, not to fidget, but to ground himself. The moderator eventually resumed the meeting, moving on to statistics and future pilot programs, but the tone had shifted. The men in suits glanced Jeremiah's way, now with something different in their is not pity, not admiration, something closer to respect, or maybe discomfort, which was just as useful by the time the roundtable ended. 3 different officials had asked for follow-up conversations. Nina, who had sat near the back, gave him a nod as he exited. Outside, the sun was still high, and the wind had picked up. Jeremiah stepped down the Capitol stairs, jacket collar turned up, his breath slow and steady. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt heard, and for now, that was enough. The corner hadn't changed much. The old gas station still had the flickering open 24 hours sign that buzzed louder than it glowed. The same cracked sidewalk ran beneath the rusted awning, stained with years of rain and oil, and lives paused in the margins. The bench across the lot still leaned to one side, held together by frayed rope and someone's desperate belief in temporary fixes, and the alley behind the dumpsters where Jeremiah once slept with his back against the brick wall, and one eye always, half open, still smelled faintly of diesel and decay. But Jeremiah had changed. It had been 6 months since the roundtable, since the center broke ground, since the letter from Alina, since he said yes to being part of something again. His beard was trimmed now, his clothes clean, the black wool coat still fit, though it was a little looser around the shoulders now, that he was eating regularly. His limp hadn't gone away, but he walked with purpose instead of just direction, and in his hand he carried a tray with 6 steaming cups of coffee and a plastic bag filled with thick cotton socks, each pair rolled tight with a rubber band. He moved slowly across the lot, not because he was tired, but because he didn't want to miss anyone. The morning was cold, and the wind carried that early warning of winter. He recognized 2 faces immediately. One was Ray, who used to huddle under cardboard and play harmonica for quarters. The other was Mona, older now, still wrapped in the same coat that looked like it had once been part of a military issue but had long since surrendered its shape. Hey Mona, he said, holding out a coffee. She blinked at him, suspicious at first. Then recognition softened her features. "Jeremiah," she said, voice raspy. He nodded. "You look different." She said, "I feel different," he replied, handing her the cup. "Here, still hot." She took it slowly, like it might disappear. Ray shuffled over next. "You back for good, man?" Jeremiah shook his head. "Not like before. I'm working now, running a place not too far from here. Vets Resource Center." Ray whistled low. "No kidding." Jeremiah dug into the bag and handed him 2 pairs of socks. "You're always the first to wear through yours." Thought ahead, they both chuckled. By mid-morning, a few more people had drifted over. A man named Lionel, who hadn't spoken a word in the 3 years Jeremiah had known him, nodded once. Before taking a cup and sitting silently on the curb, a younger guy, barely out of his teens, watched from across the street but didn't approach. Jeremiah left a pair of socks on the wall near him anyway and said nothing. He didn't give speeches, he didn't bring cameras. He wasn't here for that. He just sat for a while, sipping his own cup slowly, steam rising into the cold air. He watched as people came and went. A few asked where he'd been. One woman offered him a half-eaten granola bar. Not realizing she didn't have to anymore, he took it anyway. Later, he stood and walked to the alley. The spot where he used to sleep was still there, though the crate he'd used as a pillow had long since vanished. In its place was a flattened box, damp from last night's rain. He crouched down, pulled out a laminated card from his coat pocket, and slid it beneath the edge of the box. On it was a phone number, the overnight hotline he'd helped design. A short note written in bold marker. "You don't have to do this alone. Call anytime." As he stepped back into the sunlight, Jeremiah felt something settle in his chest. Not closure, not pride, just a quiet kind of return. He didn't want to erase this place. He just wanted to make sure no one else got stuck here longer than they had to. And as he walked away, the young man across the street finally stood up and picked up the socks. No words, just a gesture. It was enough. The air outside the shelter was crisp with the scent of brewing coffee and early morning asphalt warming under the sun. The folding table was old, the kind you had to press down at the center so the legs wouldn't lock unevenly. But it held steady now under 3 large thermal dispensers and 2 trays of pastries donated by the bakery across the street. A small line had already begun to form. Men and women bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, holding paper cups or just standing with their hands in their pockets. Waiting quietly, Jeremiah was already there, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, pouring coffee with a kind of rhythm, no rush, no pause, just steady. He offered each person eye contact, a nod, maybe a small smile. Nothing more than what was needed. He'd learned that dignity was a fragile thing out here. Offering it back without pity was often the only kindness that mattered. Then Trey arrived. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped up beside the table and began unwrapping the second tray of pastries. He wore a plain black hoodie under a tan utility vest, his hair shorter than before, his shoes scuffed but clean. He looked older, now maybe not in years, but in a way that came from nights spent thinking too long about things that can't be undone. His name tag read Trey H., Outreach Volunteer. Jeremiah glanced sideways at him but said nothing. They hadn't spoken since that day in the park, and even then, the conversation was more lesson than dialogue. But he didn't need to bring any of it up. Some things, when they're real enough, don't need to be rehashed. Trey broke the silence first. "They changed the blend this week," he said, nodding toward the coffee. Jeremiah sniffed the air and nodded. "Smells stronger," yeah, told the supplier. "We needed something with a little more kick." Morning's been rough lately. They kept working, one pouring, one handing out napkins and slices of bread. Occasionally, they'd switch places, without saying anything, like it had already been worked out before either of them showed up. A woman approached in a patchwork coat, her face lined by time and wind. Trey handed her a cinnamon bun and asked softly if she'd found a spot to sleep last night. She nodded. He smiled. "Good." Jeremiah noticed how gently he spoke. It wasn't performative. It was practiced, real. Later, as the line dwindled and the thermoses began to run low, Trey leaned against the table and looked out toward the street. Cars passed by, mostly indifferent. A bus hissed to a stop at the corner, then lurched forward again. "You remember the day we laughed at you?" Trey asked, not turning his head. Jeremiah kept wiping down the table. "I remember," he said, calm. "I thought I was tough. Thought mocking somebody meant I was strong." Trey's voice wasn't defensive, just plain spoken. Didn't know anything about pain or sacrifice, or what it meant to survive something and still stand upright. After Jeremiah didn't respond right away, he finished folding the cloth, placed it down gently, then said, "Pain teaches, if we let it." Trey looked down, his fingers curled loosely around a plastic cup. "I wish I could take it back." "You can't," Jeremiah said, "but you can show up." They both stood quietly after that, shoulder to shoulder, watching a young woman tuck 2 cups into a bag for someone who hadn't made it out of the tent encampment yet. In the background, a radio played softly through a shelter window. A familiar song, something from the early 2000s, upbeat and oddly out of place, drifted into the morning. And then Trey laughed, just a little, just enough. It wasn't the cruel laugh of 6 months ago. It wasn't loud or mocking or performative. It was the kind of laugh that comes from letting go, from breathing something out that had weighed too heavily for too long. Jeremiah looked over and chuckled too. No words, just an acknowledgement that people changed, sometimes even for the better. They went back to pouring coffee. And when the next person in line approached, both men reached out, one with a cup, the other with a pastry. No need to talk about what had been. They were already working on what came next. The sun was low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the granite plaza. The monument sat quietly near the entrance of the old military base just outside, the chain-link fence where the public could still visit without clearance. It wasn't a grand structure, not one of the towering memorials with bronze statues or wreaths. This one was simple, a curved stone wall, chest-high, with the names of fallen soldiers engraved in rows. Below them, smaller plaques honored those who returned broken and those who were never quite seen again once they came home. Jeremiah stood alone, hands tucked into the deep pockets of his coat. The flip phone felt small and weightless in his palm, though he knew it had carried more than its size suggested. The screen was cracked, the keys worn down to smooth plastic. He'd kept it for years, long after it stopped being practical, long after burner phones and smart tech had taken over. But it still worked, still connected him to the past when he needed to reach back into it. It was the phone he'd used to call Beckett, the one with only 5 numbers saved in its contacts, all of them ghosts from different chapters of his life. The one he had carried in his boot in the lining of an old duffel, wrapped in cloth to keep it from the worst of the cold. He hadn't always known why he kept it, only that someday, maybe, it would be needed, and it was. That call, the one he made after the gang laughed, had changed everything. Not just because of what it triggered on the other end, but because of what it pulled out of him. It had been a moment of surrender and of resolve, a white flag and a battle cry. He hadn't wanted to fight anymore, but he also hadn't wanted to disappear. And somehow, those two truths had found their way to the same action, reaching out. Now standing here, the base behind him, mostly quiet, save for the distant sound of drills and passing boots on gravel, Jeremiah placed the phone gently on the stone ledge beneath the plaque. He set it upright, screen closed, like a folded hand. No ceremony, no final speech, just a quiet release below the ledge. The plaque read, "For those who served and were forgotten, for those who called and were finally heard." He had written the second line himself, not for vanity, and not even for the sake of legacy, just because it felt true, the kind of truth that outlasts news cycles and viral videos, the kind that matters when you're sitting alone in a dark room. Wondering if anyone still remembers you exist, he stepped back and looked at it once more. He thought of the other vets, still out there, some just starting to fall, some already deep in the cracks. He thought of the nights under bridges and the mornings spent trying to be invisible. He thought of his daughter and her letter, and the way her voice had sounded when she finally called him back. A breeze picked up, lifting the edges of fallen leaves and carrying with it the faint smell of distant gun oil and damp pine. He pulled his coat tighter, but didn't move. He just stood there for a while longer, watching the phone sit quietly, almost like a sentinel. It wasn't about the phone itself. It never had been. It was about what it represented, the last thread to a life nearly lost, and the courage it took to pull on that thread instead of letting it fray. Eventually, Jeremiah turned and began walking down the path that led away from the base. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The auditorium lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a soft glow over the rows of restless students shifting in their seats. Sneakers tapped on scuffed linoleum. Backpacks were shoved under folding chairs, and the air held that peculiar mix of teenage impatience and fluorescent lighting. It was fourth period, and no one quite knew what to expect from the man standing at the edge of the stage. Jeremiah adjusted the mic stand, not because it needed fixing, but to give himself a moment. He wasn't used to this kind of crowd-young, untested, unaware of just how fragile their world really was. He wore his usual black coat, a faded shirt beneath it, and boots that had walked through more than he'd ever say aloud. There were no medals on display, no slideshow behind him, just him and a story. The principal introduced him in brief, careful words. Today's guest is a veteran and advocate. Please give your attention to Mr. Jeremiah Cole. There was light applause, the kind students give when told to. He didn't start with war stories. He didn't start with the day he lost his leg, or the mission that earned him a medal. He started with a bench, a sidewalk, a cup that stayed empty for hours at a time. I used to live outside a gas station, he said, voice even but steady. Not because I didn't have family, not because I didn't serve, but because I didn't know how to ask for help. The room grew quieter. I thought being strong meant doing everything alone. That asking made me weak. That if I just waited long enough, someone would see I was struggling and pull me out. He scanned the rows. No one looked away now. Waited 7 years, a teacher near the back stopped organizing papers. A girl in the third row lowered her phone, screen dimming against her leg. Jeremiah told them about silence. Not the kind that comes from quiet rooms, but the kind that lives in your own chest. Tightening around your ribs every time you want to speak but can't, he told them about pride. That feels like armor until it becomes a prison. About how easy it is to smile and nod and lie when someone asks if you're okay, and how quickly those lies pile up until they start to feel like truth. He didn't preach. He didn't cry. He just told the truth in plain words and let it sit. Then he said something that made a few heads turn. I had a friend once, Anthony Medina. We called him Doc. Best medic I ever knew. He saved lives, cracked jokes, never let anyone see him sweat. 3 years after we came home, he shot himself in a motel room. No one even knew he was hurting. The auditorium was silent. I never said his name out loud until last year. Felt like I'd failed him. But I say it now, Anthony Medina, because people deserve to be remembered. He paused and pulled a folded paper from his pocket. These are the names of 6 vets I knew personally who died after they came home. Not in combat, not from wounds, from silence. He didn't read the names with ceremony, just read them like you'd read the names of classmates, neighbors, brothers, each one heavy but not theatrical, just real dot. When he finished, he looked up. You don't have to wear a uniform to carry things. Some of you are carrying stuff right now, quiet stuff. Stuff you think no one will understand. But the worst thing you can do is carry it alone. A boy near the back wiped his face on his sleeve. A girl looked at her shoes, blinking fast. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to tell you that asking for help isn't weakness. It's the first thing that saved me, and it might be what saves you. When he stepped down from the stage, no one clapped right away. They just watched. Some stood. One teacher touched his arm and whispered, "Thank you." Later, when the bell rang, students walked out a little slower. A few hung back near the exit, unsure of what they wanted to say. One girl handed him a folded note. Another just nodded with red eyes and walked away. And for the first time in a long time, Jeremiah didn't feel like a man looking for a place to belong. He felt like he had already found one. The mornings came differently now, not louder, not brighter, just ... steadier. The kind of steady that settles into the bones without fanfare. The kind that replaces the nervous flicker of survival with something closer to rhythm. Jeremiah still rose early, though he no longer had to. The street didn't dictate his waking anymore. He got up because there were things to do, people waiting, a building to open, names to remember. He walked to the center now, fully running. Now humming with quiet motion past the mural painted on the wall out front. It wasn't of him that had been a firm condition. Instead, it was a series of faces, some old, some young, some in uniform, some not, all veterans, all rendered in shades of gray and earth. Above them, in painted script, were words he hadn't chosen, but had come to accept. No one gets forgotten. That morning, he paused beneath those words, coffee in hand, watching two volunteers carry boxers inside. Trey gave him a small wave. Nina passed by on her way to a meeting with the city council. Somewhere in the distance, someone was laughing, and it didn't sound cruel this time, just human. Most people who asked about the turning point assumed it was the phone call. That moment in the alley with the battered flip phone, or maybe the military visit, or the news coverage that followed the headlines, the segment, the interviews. He declined, but it wasn't that. Some assumed it was the flash drive. The data he'd kept hidden, the names and maps and debriefs that, in the right hands, reignited interest in long-ignored cases. Others pointed to the resource center's funding, or his seat at the round table, or even the day his daughter called him dad again. But it wasn't any of those, either. Jeremiah knew what it was, knew it deep down where the memory stayed, quiet until called. It was the moment he chose not to vanish. That was all, because it would have been easier, in a strange way, to stay silent, to keep fading. The world was good at forgetting men like him. It had systems built for it, entire bureaucracies designed to lose people in paper and waiting rooms. And silence had a strange kind of comfort until it didn't, until it wrapped too tight around the ribs and made the breath catch. The change wasn't external. It wasn't about medals or recognition. It wasn't about pity. It wasn't even about justice. It was about standing up, even with a limp, about saying quietly and plainly, "I'm still here." And what happened after that was the other half of the story, because the real shift came when someone listened to Beckett, Nina, Jasmine at the liquor store, Trey, eventually, the school kids, his daughter, even Lionel, who never spoke but always showed up when coffee was offered and music played, faintly through the shelter speakers. It was never one big moment. It was a thread, one man holding on, and others grabbing hold when they realized he was still there, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of duty, but more often than not, just because they could. Now, when people ask what changed, Jeremiah smiles in that quiet way of his and says everything, and also nothing, because the past didn't rewrite itself. His leg didn't grow back. The nights in the alley still happened, but they didn't define him anymore. They were part of the map, not the whole story. And maybe, he thought, as he unlocked the front door of the center and turned on the lights, that was the most any of them could ask for, not to be erased or glorified, but simply seen, simply heard, simply known to still exist. Because sometimes the only difference between being invisible and being remembered is one decision, not to disappear,